When we begin to talk about ethics in the outer space, it is important to slow down and first understand why ethical theory matters at all in this domain. Outer space is governed by law, yes, but the law is always reactive. Law responds after the conduct has already begun. Ethics, by contrast, operates at an earlier stage. Ethics asks not merely what is legal, but what ought to be done in the first place. This distinction becomes especially important in the outer space because the consequences of action are long lasting, often irreversible, and distributed across the entire planet and across the future generation. Outer space today is no longer a distant scientific frontier. It has become a domain of intense human activity. States deploy satellites for navigation, surveillance, and communication. Private corporations launch thousands of satellites into low Earth orbit. Plans for permanent lunar installations, Mars missions, asteroid mining, and even space tourism are no longer speculative fantasies. They are active policy projects. Yet, many of these activities raise the moral question that international treaties do not clearly answer. Ethical theory therefore becomes a necessary tool to evaluate whether our expansion into space is responsible, restrained, and just. The first ethical framework we must examine is the utilitarian ethics. Utilitarianism is a consequence oriented theory. It evaluates the morality of an action based on its outcomes rather than on intention or moral duty. According to this framework, an action is morally justified if it is produced as the greatest overall benefit for the greatest number of people. Benefit is usually understood in terms of welfare, happiness, or utility. This approach is especially attractive in the technological and policy context because it aligns well with the quantitative analysis. Cost can be measured, benefit can be projected, risk can be calculated. This is precisely why utilitarian reasoning dominates the contemporary space policy, even when it is not explicitly acknowledged. When governments justify the satellite infrastructure, they do so by pointing to the global benefits, such as navigation satellites support aviation safety and maritime trade. Communication satellites enable internet access, education, and economic development. Earth observation satellites assist in climate monitoring, disaster response, and moreover, very beneficial for the agricultural planning. The moral argument underlying all of these initiatives is essentially the utilitarian. Billions of people benefit, therefore, the activity is justified. The same reasoning is used to justify the development of mega constellations. Private companies argue that global internet access reduces the inequality and promotes social inclusion. Even though these constellations contribute to the orbital congestion and light pollution, the aggregate benefit they claim outweighs the harm. Large-scale exploration projects are also defended in the utilitarian terms. Mission to the Mars or to the moons are justified only on the basis that they advance scientific knowledge, drive technological innovation, and may even ensure the long-term survival of humanity as a species. However, utilitarian ethics encounters serious difficulties when it is applied to the outer space. The first difficulty that arises from the problem of time. Space activities often have consequences that extend far beyond the present generation. Orbital debris do not consequently disappear quickly. Once generated, it remains in the orbit for decades or centuries, increasing the risk of collisions and limiting access to the space. Planetary contamination is permanent. If extraterrestrial environments are altered by human activity, there is no way to restore them to their original state. Utilitarianism asks us to weigh the present benefits against the future harm, but it also provides that no clear method for doing so. Future generations cannot participate in the decision making. Their interests are uncertain and often discounted. As a result, Immediate benefits to the present actors tend to dominate the ethical calculations. This creates a moral imbalance. We enjoy the convenience and profits of space technology today, while the future generation inherit risk, scarcity, and degraded environments. The second difficulty lies in the irreversible nature of many space activities. On Earth, environmental damage can sometimes be mitigated or reversed, but in space, this is rarely the important case. For example, if the Mars is contaminated with Earth-based microbes, we permanently lose the opportunity to study the pristine extraterrestrial life. If the orbital pathways become unusable due to debris, access to the space becomes restricted for all future actors. Utilitarian reasoning may still justify these actions if the projected benefits are sufficiently large, but once the harm occurs, no future ethical recalculation can undo it. Now, this creates a dangerous moral loophole where irreversible damage is treated as an acceptable collateral. The third difficulty that concerns is about the power and the visibility. Utilitarian calculations tend to privilege benefits that are measurable and visible. Economic gains, technological progress, and national prestige are easily quantified. By the contrast, many harms associated with these space activities are diffuse and difficult to measure. Communities living near the launch sites may suffer environmental and health impacts. Astronomers particularly face increasing difficulty in observing the night sky due to the light pollution. Entire populations are subject to the constant surveillance through the space-based technologies. These harms are real, but they are often excluded from the utilitarian analysis because they are not easily aggregated. Only for these reasons, utilitarian ethics, while useful, cannot serve as the sole moral foundation of outer space governance. We must therefore turn to a second framework, one that places moral limits of conduct regardless of outcomes. This brings us Kantian ethics. Now, Kantian ethics is grounded on the idea of moral duty. Unlike the utilitarianism, it does not ask whether an action produces the good results. Instead, it asks whether the action itself is morally permissible or not. According to Immanuel Kant, a moral action must satisfy two conditions. The first, it must be capable of being universalized. In other words, the rule guiding action must be the one that everyone could follow without any contradictions. Second, it must respect rational beings as ends in themselves, not merely as a means to achieve the goals. When it is applied to the outer space, Kantian ethics introduces the powerful constraint. It requires us to ask whether a particular mode of conduct could be adopted by all space actors without undermining the very condition that make space activity possible. Consider orbital debris again. If a single actor neglects debris mitigation, the immediate harm may appear minimal. But if the actor behaved in this way, the Earth's orbital environment would become unusable. The action therefore fails the test of universalization and is morally impermissible, regardless of short-term benefits. Kantian ethics also challenges the instrumental view of outer space. It rejects the idea that space is merely a means of economic, strategic, or scientific ends. Outer space is a shared domain. Treating it purely as a resource warehouse or a military high ground violates the moral requirement to respect shared conditions of human activity. This reasoning aligns closely with the foundational principles of international space law, particularly the principle of peaceful use, non-appropriation, and the most important, the state responsibility. Kantian ethics strengthen these legal norms by grounding them in moral duty rather than the political convenience. Now, one of the most important contributions of the Kantian ethics in the space context is its emphasis on responsibility in absence of enforcement. Outer space lacks effective policing mechanisms. The main issue that revolves around is jurisdiction. As the jurisdiction is fragmented, attribution of harm is complex. In such an environment, reliance on legal sanctions alone is insufficient. Kantian ethics insists that moral obligation exists even when violations are unlikely to be punished. This is particularly relevant for emerging technologies such as autonomous satellites and artificial intelligence driven space systems, where the decisions may be made without immediate human oversight. Yet, even Kantian ethics does not fully address all of these ethical concerns. It tells us what duty do we owe, but it does not clearly identify whose interest must be protected. For this, we turn to the rights-based ethics. Now, the rights-based ethics clearly focuses on entitlements that must not be violated, regardless of their benefit or efficiency. Rights function as moral boundaries. They establish the limit that cannot be crossed, even in the name of progress. Traditionally, space law has recognized states as a primary holder of rights. Ethical thinking, however, has evolved beyond this narrow framework. One of the most significant developments is the right-based thinking is the recognition of the rights of future generation. Future humans have a moral claim to safe and accessible space. They have a right to inherit an orbital environment that is not cluttered with a debris and a space governance system that is not monopolized by the few powerful actors. These rights impose obligation on present-day decision makers, even though the future generation cannot assert their claims directly. The right-based ethics also emphasize the collective rights of humanity. Outer space is often described as the province of all humankind. This idea carries the ethical weight. Exclusive appropriation of lunar or asteroid resources may undermine the humanity's collective interest in shared scientific access and equitable benefit sharing. When space activities are dominated by a small number of states or corporations, the rights of the global community are at the risk of being eroded. Finally, the right-based ethics invites us to consider environmental as well as ecological rights. There is a growing ethical debate about whether the celestial bodies possesses intrinsic value beyond the human use, even if they do not hold any rights in the legal sense. They may warrant moral consideration. This perspective challenges purely anthropocentric approach to the space and governance that encourages restraint in activities which will cause an irreversible harm to the extraterrestrial environments. Therefore, the right-based ethics establish a non-negotiable moral limits. Surveillance technologies must respect privacy rights. Resource exploitation must respect collective human interest. Militarization must respect to the rights of security and peace. These limits cannot be overridden by the claims of efficiency, profit, or technological advancement. To conclude this part of the lecture, it is important to see these ethical frameworks are not as competing alternatives but as a complementary tools. Utilitarian ethics help us assessing the benefits and risk. On the other hand, Kantian ethics imposes the duties as well as the moral constraint. And at the last, right-based ethics establishes the inviolable boundaries. Together, they form a moral architecture which is capable of guiding the responsible conduct in the outer space. Thank you.